With all of that said, welcome to the Clinical Athlete Journal Club, number 26. My name is Quinn Hennick, and I am a proud clinical athlete provider. And I am joined by Kevin McNamara, who's a physical therapist in the Seattle area. He's a longtime Clinical Athlete Forum member and the one responsible for bringing this journal club to life. So thanks for being here as always, Kevin.
Yeah, absolutely. This will be fun. Let's let it ride, see what happens.
That's right. That's what we always do. We're also joined by our new Clinical Athlete Journal Club intern, Megan Broussard, who is a student PT down in Texas at UT Southwestern. Say hi to the people.
Hello.
Everyone say hi to Megan. Congratulate her on the first, we're in week 2 of the Clinical Athlete Journal Club internship, and she's been killing it. She's been absolutely killing it. Our systems are already 1,000 times better, and I'm not exaggerating. So that just, it's either an indictment on me or it just shows how awesome Megan is, maybe a little bit of both. And I think, is Taylor present? Megan, did you see her name?
I have not seen her yet.
Okay. Well, we're gonna make a toast to Taylor Allen Flanick, who this past week just finished her 6-month clinical athlete internship, the first ever clinical athlete intern, and she passed the first try. So let's give a little shout out in the chat, even though that Taylor's not here. We'll tell her that everybody said congratulations. And she had so much pity on us that she's actually agreed to stick around and be an integral part of the clinical athlete team moving forward. So we're super excited about that. Okay. So last thing here, in case you're curious about the motivation for these meetings, way back in the day, a smart guy named Benjamin Franklin started a weekly club that was called the Junto Club, and it was a mutual improvement club. But it was basically just a room of really smart people discussing topics and issues of the day, kind of like this. And they had an important policy that we've adopted as the Clinical Athlete Journal Club motto, and that is, these discussions are conducted in a sincere spirit of inquiry, after truth, without fondness of dispute or desire of victory. So we relish discussions, we encourage discussions, but we're not coming in here with an agenda. We're not coming in here looking to win. We're all just trying to be a little bit less wrong. And so we're all on the same team, and hopefully, we can come in with that mindset and come out better for it. So tonight's journal club topic is exercise progression to incrementally load the Achilles tendon. And that's actually the name of the paper. I'm going to launch a poll just to get a feel for the room, and you should have that in front of you now. So we're just looking to get a glimpse of who we're looking at tonight. Clinician, student clinician, coach trainer, student coach trainer. So pick one of those if you see it. Give you a few minutes. Looks like we've got about 35% are clinicians, about 40% student clinicians. So that's a big student turnout tonight. That's cool. A quarter of you are coach or trainer. Awesome. All right. I'll just share that real quick. So digging into this paper, interesting paper. So again, the title, exercise progression to incrementally load the Achilles tendon, lead author Josh Baxter. And essentially, I'll just go through kind of a quick rundown of what they did and what they were looking at. And I'll throw it to Kevin for some of his thoughts. And then we'll field any questions, and we'll break you guys out and give you some prompts to talk about. Then we'll come back together as a group. But essentially, this group of authors were looking to understand the loading mechanics during common exercises that you'll see in either exercise training programs or specifically rehab programs for the Achilles tendon. And what they were looking to do was model this list of exercises in regards to the different types of loading and the magnitude of load that it puts through the Achilles tendon to create a progression of exercise. And we usually do this in the clinic intuitively by saying, what type of exercise is going to put the least to the most amount of load compared to what the athlete's going to be able to tolerate in their current capacity. And then we just kind of make a judgment call. But what these authors were trying to do is actually quantify that and give us a consistent index of those exercises using a consistent methodology. So the purpose of the paper was to establish that exercise progression of incrementally loading the Achilles tendon. And they had 8 healthy adults, 6 males and 2 females. They stuck a bunch of sensors on their pelvis and their lower extremity, and they had them do a list of 25 plus exercises with the sensors and a 3D motion camera capturing the kinematics. And they were also on force plates. So they were capturing the kinetics, or the forces going through the lower extremity during these exercises. So they're looking at both motion, kinematics, and the forces going through the system, kinetics. And you can see the list of exercises way in the back of this paper. So this paper is pre-print, meaning it's been accepted to be published in a journal, but it hasn't actually been published yet. And that's why it kind of looks a little wonky, and all the tables and figures are in the back, and the captions are kind of miscombobulated, but that's why it looks like that. But if you look on page 29 of the paper or 28 of the paper, excuse me, on page 28 and table 1, it's the same thing on table or on page 29, but you can see the list of exercises there. So they did all those exercises, had a bunch of sensors on them, looking at them through 3D motion, having them perform these exercises on the force plates. And they're looking to create a progression or an index of how much these exercises load the Achilles tendon. And it was kind of cool. What they did was they kind of compared it to walking and running. So if you see in some of the figures, figure 2, and figure 2, 3, and 4, you can see comparisons with some of these exercises, along with how much load is going through the Achilles tendon during walking and running. So it kind of gives you an idea of comparisons there. But specifically, I think the conversation tonight will probably be based around how we're defining load. So through some biomechanist wizardry and inverse kinematics and dynamics, they're able to determine or approximate the joint angles and joint motions during these movements. And then from those joint angles, with the ground reaction forces that they measure from the force plates, they're able to approximate the forces that are going through the lower extremity, or going through the system. And that's how they approximate the load that's going through the Achilles tendon. But they were specifically looking at 3, we'll call them classes of load, or how we'll quantify the force through the Achilles tendon. Exactly what does that mean? But if you look on figure 1, which is on page 24, figure 1B, you'll see an XY plot there. And they were looking at 3 categories of load. Peak load through the Achilles tendon, which is whatever exercise you want on that table. There's a double leg calf raise, a drop jump, a lunge, a squat, whatever it was. They looked at peak load of all those exercises. So what is the most load that's going through the Achilles tendon during the execution of that exercise? I don't care when it happens. I just want to know the highest load that's going through that tendon. And so peak load is one way that we're quantifying load through the Achilles tendon. Another way is impulse, which if you look at that graph, figure 1B, impulse is the area under the curve. It's force multiplied by time, or it's the force applied to the tissue across time. They also define it as time under tension, or we could say impulse is the time that force is being applied. The units are Newton seconds, typically what you'll see. In this case, they quantified it, or the units used for impulse was body weights seconds, but it's force multiplied by time. So you can think of an exercise that happens really fast is going to have a short time epoch, and whatever force you can generate in that time period is your impulse. Or you have an exercise in which force is being generated across a longer period of time, and we'll measure impulse in that exercise that way. So that's impulse. So we've got peak load of each exercise, the loading impulse of each of these exercises, and then the loading rate, or the rate of load, the change in force over the change in time. How fast does the load go up, or how fast do we get to that point? You guys still have my audio? Say, okay, million heads just went like that. Good. Something weird happened. Sorry. And what they did was they took increments in each of 5 milliseconds of the exercise. They took the fastest loading rate. Wherever the fastest loading rate happened during the exercise, that's what they took. So now we have 3 ways to quantify load through the Achilles: peak, rate, and impulse. Now it's a question of, do we weight those 3 things equally? And they did not. And this is interesting. And I think this is the conversation that will be interesting to have from a rehab standpoint, from a performance standpoint. When this paper actually comes out, they're going to have a really cool online tool where you can kind of mess with the numbers yourself. It wasn't available in this preprint, but that'll be pretty cool. But essentially, they weighted peak force the highest. So it went, they scaled peak force to be 50% of their index, impulse to be 30%, and rate to be 20%. So basically they said, we're going to weight the peak load and the impulse going through the Achilles tendon. We're going to say that's got more relevance than loading rate. And they created their own index. Basically, so they're able to take all those 3 loading parameters and create a score, essentially. It's made up. This is just kind of proof of concept. And that's what they discuss in the discussion of the paper, is that we may disagree with the scaling index, or we may put more weight on another parameter versus, I may say loading rate is more important than peak, and we can have that conversation. But this is what they did. And if you look on page 28, those exercises are now broken down by their loading index. And then to the right of the loading index, you can see where peak and impulse and rate fall. And then the last thing I'll say before I throw it to Kevin, they broke this up into 4 tiers, essentially just cut from 0 to 1, from a 0 to a 1 score on their index that they created. They basically just quartered it. And they created 4 tiers, whereas tier 1 are exercises that are putting less overall load through the Achilles tendon all the way through tier 4. So if you think about it from a exercise progression standpoint, that's what they're trying to build for you, which was interesting. So in like the biggest nutshell ever, that's kind of the paper. And then I'm going to throw it to Kevin and get his thoughts, and we'll field any questions, and then we'll break out. Kevin, what do you think about this piece?
Yeah, so I thought this paper was really pretty cool, the way that they set it up, and it does a good job at answering some of the questions, at least that I kind of have in my mind when we're talking about, tendon pathology, because, we know that load is effective based off the literature that we have. It seems like loading is kind of our best bet in terms of managing some of this, but I think the type of loading is something that is far less certain. And, the mechanisms behind that influence the positive tendon response is something else entirely, I think. But to me, I thought it was really useful, not only one from a practical implementation standpoint in terms of just maybe getting in the arena in terms of determining where can we kind of start with this person, but 2, kind of understanding that maybe it's more so, like you mentioned, peak force and impulse that seem to be the mechanism that's responsible for tendon recovery and healing. And I thought that was interesting because a lot of times when I think about that, my mind immediately kind of goes to, playing around with time under tension. But the fact that they were able to kind of break out into, variable patterns and manipulating different types of movements, kind of getting it to the same endpoint that we would want to be with something like heavier loads with increased time under tension. I thought there was a lot of value in that, and it's something that I hadn't necessarily considered. So to me, I think it provides information in terms of directing interventions and places that we can possibly go, manipulating more variables as opposed to simply contraction type, but also looking at things like what pattern are we putting this person in, and can we maybe use that as a secondary tool to kind of drive the adaptations that we're after. So I think it provides a lot of value in that sense, because it expands sort of the tools that we can use to drive some positive adaptations. So I thought this.
Yeah, I liked it too. I mean, again, they created that loading index, and I'm gonna just kind of give you guys an example of how the numbers can affect that. But I really I liked how the discussion in which they described that you may disagree, and here's basically the calculator, and you can mess with this yourself. But just to give you guys an example of what we're talking about, if you look on table 1 on page 28, I just kind of highlighted an example. And I'll just share my screen because I don't know how many of you guys have the paper up, but I'll just go ahead and do this. It's always a disaster when I try to share my screen, but here we go. Okay. So we're looking at tier 2. I'm just kind of a rebounding heel raise and a standing heel raise. They're both single leg. I don't know exactly what rebounding heel raise means, but what I conceptualize that to mean is that you're like kind of making it almost plyometric at the bottom, where you're catching a little bit of a bounce and you're springing back up. I could be wrong, but let's just say that's what it is. The rebounding heel raise, first of all, they're both in tier 2. So my interpretation from the discussion was that basically the same exercises that are in the same tier can be used interchangeably from a loading standpoint. Like, you don't have to question, oh, should I use a seated heel raise here, or should I use a high step up? If they're on tier 1, they're interchangeable from the magnitude from their load, according to their loading index, which is nice. But what if you have somebody who, I'm jumping the gun here because I want to ask you guys this, but a rebounding heel raise and a standing heel raise don't seem like the same thing when we're thinking about it from a rate standpoint. But if you look at the loading index, the rebounding heel raise is in the same tier, and it's actually just below the standing heel raise. But let's look at the actual parameters. So loading peak, you'll see that rebounding heel raise is higher, but the standard deviation is also higher. So I would say that this is relatively 4.2 and 3.0, relatively close. So we'll just call that relatively equal, slight nod to rebounding heel raise. But look at rate. So the rate of load is double in the rebounding heel raise, which makes sense, right? Because it's kind of that ballistic, I should say more plyometric. You're getting some stretch reflex at the bottom, and you're kind of using that spring mechanism. So the rate at which you increase the load through the tendon is double in the rebounding heel raise. But yet they're both in tier 2. So you know, according to this model, you conceptualize them the same. So I don't know, that's just a point of discussion. And then if you look at impulse, which is, again, they define as time under tension, the standing heel raise wins there because that makes sense. It's slower. You're under tension for longer. So you're producing load for a longer period of time. So you have a higher impulse. The impulse for the rebounding heel raise is pretty small, 150% less, because it's happening really quickly. And you're probably getting that spring out of the bottom of the movement. So when they take the scale, 50% for peak, 30% for impulse, 20% for rate, it ends up that the standing heel raise is a little bit higher on the loading index. But when you look at these specific parameters, you're getting something slightly different. And they totally acknowledge that in the discussion. And that's why they say manipulate the numbers to see how the table changes. But that's what I wanted to use an example there to kind of bring it to your attention. Kevin, you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would kind of open this up to everybody, but to me, I think loading rate is something that I would kind of weigh a little bit more so, as opposed to kind of peak loads. Just when I'm thinking about, a symptomatic tendon, it's, from what I've seen and, my experiences, rate seems to be kind of the biggest factor in terms of general response to that. So I guess if I was building this out, I maybe would have put a little bit more weight with regards to rate of loading as opposed to peak loading. But that's kind of my thoughts there. What do you think about that?
I would agree. So these are healthies, right? And they're specifically mentioned that they say in the paper why. They say due to the viscous elastic properties of the Achilles tendon, we scaled impulse and peak higher, but I would have liked them to parse that out a little bit more. I don't actually know what they mean by that. Are they saying that because the Achilles has has these viscoelastic properties that impulse is just what it does, or I'm sorry, rate is just what it's already good at. And what you'll get an actual more adaptation from is impulse and peak. So we're going to weight those as more important from an exercise progression standpoint. I wasn't super clear on why they chose those.
Yes. So I think my understanding is it's more high strain over longer periods of time. That's kind of the driver of tendon adaptation. Is that correct? Would that be a reason why?
Maybe that's what I took out of the 2015 Baum article,
Yeah.
where they said plyometrics are kind of equivocal with tendon adaptations, but high sustained load or isometrics, isotonics, maybe more. But Scott's got something to say here.
Yeah.
Scott, can you? Oh, yeah, I got you. Hold on. I just asked you to unmute yourself. There we go.
I think I saw that. Yeah, so I thought that their study was interesting and their attempt at stratification was relatively garbage because it doesn't give us anything to your point of there's no value in this without understanding what you're trying to do. So to your point of strain, peak rate, time under tension is not a good definition of impulse. It would be tension over time, or total tension over time would be a better discussion. Time under tension is really just how long you're doing the thing, and it has no relevance to the amount of force being done. From a tendon perspective, if there's no strain, you get no gain, right? So it's all about strain for the tendon. You need that elongation to occur in order to get adaptation. And there's also a window in which that elongation is optimal. So it seems somewhere from 4 to 6 or so % is where we see the biggest benefit. Below 3 doesn't seem to really do much. And above 9 seems to also start being problematic. The other issue we run into with this is the viscoelastic aspect, which is the faster you load it, the more it responds as an elastic tissue, as opposed to the slower you load it, the more it responds as a viscous tissue. So you're going to get more strain with a slow load. The other thing that we see is that with these tendons, pre-tension or not will play a role, because some of these studies that measure it, or some of these exercises that have pre-tensioning, when they actually go in and measure, you're already getting some strain. And so that's where plyometrics might not necessarily give us quite as much. If you're landing with a pre-tensioned loading, you're already taking out some of the slack of the system, and therefore it's going to respond differently than if you loaded from a relaxed tendon or not. So I'd say overall, I really enjoyed the paper, but for me, it was the precision. Like they're trying to mix together 3 different concepts that are all very important in their own right. And I found it kind of odd that they just randomly assigned very low loads to certain exercises that could potentially be loaded relatively high.
Like the poor seated calf raise.
Kilos, right?
Yeah, and they just went single leg, double leg with the 15 kilo, and there was no, like, that to me would have been, explore that out, load the single leg up, keep going up. We know that we get a massive amount of force here. So the assignment of these exercises are based off of arbitrary loads when it's non-body weight. And then when it's body weight, it's really more rate constrained. So I would look at their approach and how they did it would be probably best to just maximize this from a rate perspective. Get rid of impulse, because for what they did, impulse doesn't really matter quite as much, because it's really rate and peak that are going to change. And that's only with the body weight type loads. So.
Boom. Scott, they mentioned in the discussion about their process was less invasive in regards to kind of measuring tendon adaptation, these types of things. If you could, like, if technological constraints weren't an issue, what would what parameters would you use in regards to what are most meaningful from an exercise progression standpoint? We're throwing out impulse just for the sake of their model. Let's throw out impulse, but is there anything that would take its place?
So if you had the ideal setup, I think the work by Amperensi or whatever is, I can't ever remember his name, but looking at individualizing load. And the thing is, external load is a proxy for internal strain. What we're looking at is, it's not that over 70% load equals any sort of particular tendon strain. It's that and really it's like Boehm's paper found that over 70% is where they started seeing adaptations. However, when you look at the loads and strains, it seems to be somewhere around 80, 85 is where the likelihood of getting sufficient strain to the tendon starts hitting levels that it's worth having applied it, if that makes sense. So it's really more just a probabilistic type judgment. So if you were capable of figuring this out, the two big things that I think are necessary to understand here is, one, how much strain is occurring in the tendon, and that you would need some sort of ultrasound and 3D type measure to see. What you're looking at is the tendon strain or the change in anchor. So the calcaneus basically is what they'll look at, and how much that changes during the lift, and then they'll also have a ultrasound on that tendon to see the strain. The second thing is, where is the force coming from? So I think you and I at CSM with Rich really were talking about this, and the knee flexion versus straight, right? So if because of the morphological characteristics of the Achilles tendon, a straight leg and a bent leg exercise, because of the fact that different parts of the tendon are being pulled on, whether it's gastroc or soleus, will significantly bias whether or not the gastroc or the soleus are actually getting the load. So really, from especially Achilles perspective, since this is a more complex tendon, the morphology of the individual probably dictates this more than just about anything else. And so unless you know that, you can't really know whether or not what's happening is what you think it is.
And in this paper, they made quite a bit of assumptions in regards to the actual model. They used the same moment arm for everyone, 5 centimeters.
Yes.
Yeah, but maybe a good start. I would like to know where they're going to go, or other groups where they take this type of stuff. I mean, I think we're clamoring for something like this, modeling exercise progression, the concept,
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, overall, I like it. Silbernagel's great. My biggest issue is it seems to me that it tried to be more than what it was. This was a great understanding of, here is a general understanding of the rates and loads with some common exercises. And I think their model attempted to address the idea that each of these are different. I'm finding, like, without context, the idea of it's like taking your plate and just stirring everything up and then saying it tastes like, there's a reason why we have different entrees, because each one has a different flavor and we have it for a different reason. And that was kind of what I got from this.
Oh, I said something really funny about ranch and mixing my food up, but I muted myself, so I can't repeat it. It's not funny the second time. Well, thanks, Scott. I really appreciate that. Let's take that into the breakout rooms. So I'm going to